Hello, welcome to Confessions of a Frustrated Game Master. I am Robert, the narrator, and thank you for joining me for another episode of Confessions. This episode of Confessions, I'm going to continue to talk about my Vampire Nations Cypher system game. I started the game a couple of weeks ago. Last episode, I talked about the seedling of a crazy idea that I had for the game and the setting that I started to develop. And now I want to talk about some of the vampire nations or tribes that I created for the game and talk about the first session of the game. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right into it. So last episode, I talked about this crazy fantasy game where all of the PCs are going to play vampires. When they feed off of a fantasy creature's blood, they temporarily get those creatures' abilities. And I talked about the setting that I created around this inkling of an idea in which the vampire nations existed on a continent, and the continent was attacked by powerful humans who drove the vampire tribes into a pocket dimension. And now, from this pocket dimension, these vampire nations are sending small parties back into their former world to find a MacGuffin called the Helm of Evernight. And of course, the PC party is one of the parties that have been sent back to try to find this MacGuffin. But I needed more than that. I needed some tribes. And what I decided to do is I decided to use one of the three important aspects of characters from Cypher system to define at least a little bit these tribes for the player characters. I did kind of the same thing with Eclipse Phase. So when you have a Cypher system character, you have three main aspects for this character that are important, that build the character. You have a descriptor, you have a type, and you have a focus. Essentially, your type is your character class, be it a fighter or charismatic type or magic user type. And you have your focus, which is kind of how your character does their fighting if they're a warrior, or how your character may do magic if they're a magic user. Just a brief description there. And the descriptor, I'll read that directly from the Cypher system rulebook. It says here that your descriptor defines your character. It flavors everything you do. The differences between a charming explorer and a graceful explorer are considerable. The descriptor changes the way those characters go about every action. Your descriptor places your character in the situation, the first adventure, which starts the campaign, and helps provide motivation. And helps provide motivation. It is the adjective of the sentence, I am an adjective, noun, who, verbs. And they're discussing there how you build your character. You build them from a sentence. Your character's name is an adjective, noun, who, verbs. The adjective is the descriptor, the noun is the type or character class, and the verb is your character's focus. So I decided to use these descriptors to define the tribes of the game. There are 10 tribes that I created. I have a tribe called the Bravi. Those vampires are appealing. So members of that tribe are appealing, or at least the player character members of that tribe have the appealing descriptor. Then you have the Dark Heart. They are cruel. They have the cruel descriptor. You have the Drift. They are mystical. You have the Doom Walkers. They have the doomed descriptor. You have the Ernert, who are strong. The Lonos, who have the exiled descriptor. You have the Razor, who are vengeful. You have the Sideal, who are stealthy. The Twist, who are weird. They are actually a branch off of the Drift, the mystical tribe. And then you have the Vincen, who are tough. So there are approximately 50 different descriptors in total in the Cypher system rulebook. And I chose these descriptors to kind of set a mood for the setting. The other types of descriptors in the game are resilient, noble, naive, tongue-tied, virtuous, wealthy, driven, dishonorable. So there are a ton of other descriptors, but I decided to go with appealing, cruel, mystical, doomed, exiled, vengeful, stealthy, weird, tough, to kind of really set a mood for the game. So my 3 players decided to go with all different descriptors or tribes for their characters. Now, what I did, something that I wanted to try and I thought it would be interesting is, normally when you start a game, you want to make sure that the party is diverse enough to go up against the things that you have planned for them, or what they most likely will come across. And for some reason, what I wanted to do was I wanted to have the players not plan their party, not to try to be as diverse as possible. I wanted them to sit down and play the character that they wanted to play, no matter what. Now, luckily, Cypher's system is a very forgiving system in that way, because the characters have the ability to heal themselves 4 times a day. So you don't necessarily have to have a fighter and a magic user and someone who can heal, because all of the characters can heal themselves. So that makes the game a little bit more forgiving. So I wanted to figure out in the fiction why the players would not know one another. And I decided on having the magic in the world, at least the vampire's ability to travel back into their former world from this pocket dimension, to not completely be under the control of the vampire tribes. So what I imagine is that the vampire tribes have shaman or seers who can feel the flows of magic, and magic flows and ebbs, and there are times when magic is strong enough to send parties back into the formal world to look for this MacGuffin. And also, the tribes don't know who is going to be sent back. Essentially, when the time is right, all of the tribes have trials, and the winners of those trials are the ones who get sent back when enough magical energy is predicted to be available by the tribe's shaman or seers. So that is the way that I kind of, in the fiction, determined that you guys are not going to know each other. Now, what I wanted to do was to increase the opportunities for role-playing around the idea of the characters not knowing each other. Now, to be honest with you, I wasn't super satisfied with how the guys handled it. A couple of the guys in the group are not really heavy into getting into character and role playing and staying in character and only saying things that their character would say. So the payoff that I thought I would have around the guys role playing who they are and how they interact in the world and who they were in their tribe, it kind of fell a little flat, because essentially what they did is they did what they would do in a normal game when they were sitting down to make their characters, except that their character was already completed, and they just basically sat down and said, you know, I'm a fighter, I punch stuff, I break stuff. And, you know, they really didn't do it in character, and it really wasn't something that was role played strongly. So that kind of that idea kind of fell through. But interestingly enough, everybody, of course, made a member of a different tribe. Well, I don't want to say of course, because I haven't talked about that yet. But and they were all fairly different as far as what type of character they were. So my 3-player group, excuse me, one of my players selected to be a Doom Walker, the Doomed descriptor, And one of my players decided to be of the Ernert tribe, so they used a strong descriptor. And one of my players decided to be of the Vincent. They are tough. And I really like the decisions that they made. And something else that I decided to do, which has really gone well, I believe, excuse me, because I didn't know that I had a bunch of players who wanted to be super collaborative with creating the fiction of the world. I have played with some of these guys in this small group for many, many years, and I really never knew that they would be so into the idea of making decisions about the world and playing in a game where the world's rules haven't been set in stone like I normally like to do. They want to help create the world, and it was very convenient that they wanted to do so because I have not had, excuse me, a ton of opportunity to work on this setting. So it was a very welcomed change to have these guys come up with ideas for the world and also come up with ideas for their individual tribe. So not only did I tell them to make their characters and not discuss who their character was, backed up by the fiction, but I also told them to come up with the appearance of their tribe members and what their tribes are all about based on the descriptor. So what I want to do now is I want to go over some of the descriptors just to break down a little bit what the characters came up with. So my one friend who decided to play a Doom Walker, who have the doomed descriptor. Essentially, what the doomed descriptor says is you are quite certain that your fate is leading you inextricably toward a terrible end. This fate might be yours alone, or you might be dragging along the others closest to you. You gain the following characteristics. And I'll go over these characteristics really quickly, even though they're very mechanically based and you may not be familiar with the mechanics of the game. But essentially, they have an ability called Jumpy, which increases the character's speed. I guess being doomed will make you a jumpy person. Then they get a skill. They are always on the lookout for danger, so they get a perception, increase in their perception skill. And then they are defense-minded. Being doomed makes you defense-minded, and they get an increase in their speed defense. So when they're dodging or trying to avoid excuse me, traps, they get a bonus there. And then the character is also cynical and expect the worst. Thus, they are resilient to mental shocks. You are trained in intellect defense tasks having to do with losing your sanity. And also, one other thing, Doom, excuse me, every time the GM uses a GM intrusion on your character, you cannot refuse it, and you do not get the XP for it. This is because you are doomed. The universe is a cold, uncaring place. That probably is a bunch of mumbo-jumbo to you if you aren't familiar with the Cypher system, so I'll explain it really quickly. Mechanically, during the game, anytime that the GM wants, when they want to make things more interesting for your character, they can do a GM, what's called a GM intrusion. And a GM intrusion can be anything that kind of spices up the scene, spices up the scenario, makes the character's day more difficult. For instance, if you wanted to spice things up and a character pulls out their weapon, you can say it slips out of their hand and goes tumbling across the other side of the room. And what you would do is you would give them 2 experience points for that happening. And 2 experience points is a really good amount. That's usually a quarter or so of what a character would normally get during for one session, and they keep one of those experience points and can give another experience points to another player, and they have to justify why they are giving it to the other player. But a doomed character, when they suffer a GM intrusion, because they're doomed, they don't get their experience point for that, but they still can give an experience point to another party member. So that is a very interesting mechanic. I really love that that one of my players decided to be a Doom Walker. And just quickly, I'll describe my other player who's playing Ernert, who the Ernert are strong. And strong is fairly straightforward. You're extremely strong and physically powerful. You use these qualities well, whether through violence or feats of prowess. You likely have a brawny build and impressive muscles. And they get +4 to their might, which is basically their strength. They are trained in breaking inanimate objects. They become trained in all jumping actions. And they also get an extra medium or heavy weapon during character creation. So that is the Ernert. And I told the guys to come up with an appearance for their characters and to really make the decisions of what these descriptors really mean for their characters, and they really got into that. So the first session, I described the pocket dimension that the vampire tribes were forced to flee to, called the Evernight. And the Evernight basically is a sunless pocket realm that is a rocky, mountainous terrain, and all of the terrain is obsidian black stone. And I started the first session with the players going to the dimensional circle that will transport them magically back into their home dimension to search for this MacGuffin called the Helm of Evernight. So I described them walking through this obsidian rocky terrain where all of the large rocks and boulders are jagged and look like they were jutting up toward the black sky. I described to them off in the distance, you can see several large bonfires from the locations that are occupied by members of the different tribes. And I also described these large glowing globes about the size of small two-story buildings that periodically floated in the air, lighting this pocket dimension for the vampire tribes. And I described the obsidian terrain turning gray and then turning tan and then turning a marble white, and described a well-chiseled path leading up to a marble white cavern that has been well worked and has a large ornate marble arch that they walk into. And I described for them the fact that their footprints left obsidian black prints on the white marble path that has been carved in the side of this area that is rocky white marble. And they walk down this impossibly long hallway into this dimensional chamber, all of carved white marble. And I had the players determine how many members of the tribe are sent in for the ritual of sending individuals back to their home dimension. I let them make that determination, and I let them describe themselves and what their tribe members look like. And they really got into that, and they seem to love having this amount of control. And I'm a little embarrassed that playing with these guys for so long that it has taken me this long to realize that these guys want to have a real hand in molding the world. They don't want a world that has been determined that they will play in and affect. They want to affect the world at the creation level, and they really seem to get into this idea. And I quickly described a circular marble chamber with a circular dimensional circle carved into the marble floor, and 3 terraces in this cavernous marble, perfectly worked chamber. And in this large runic circle, there were 20 different depressions moving around the circumference of this circle, or this this dimensional circle in the ground. And I described drums playing. I described individuals wearing red long robes and holding large barrels at particular points on this dimensional circle in the ground. And I described the players walking to the circle, laying their bodies into the depressions in this circle. And then I described the individuals in red robes standing at the particular tribal spots on this dimensional circle of marble, or this magical circle, dumping a oily black liquid into the depression. And the liquid filled the depression that the player character laid in until the player character was invisible. And then I described a rumbling and a grinding sound of stone against stone as the dimensional circle holding the 3 PCs began to spin. And between these 10 pairs of depressions, there were runic carvings in the marble, and the black oily liquid began from the force of the circle spinning. The black oily liquid began to seep through the runic carvings from the depression that the PC had laid in into the depression next to him that was empty. And once the oil had completely, or this oily black liquid had completely slid into the depression next to the PC that was formerly empty, the PC's depression was empty. So the process of transporting back into their home dimension was completed, and a couple of other things happened in the first session, but this has gone on, this episode has gone on long enough, so I'm going to save that until another episode. But thank you very much for checking out this episode. Thanks for listening to my crazy ideas, and I really appreciate it. So good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever and whenever you are. Thanks a lot, guys.